This makes the avoidant friendly EA. There is something most people only begin to understand after they have already been hurt or confused in a relationship with someone who shows avoidant patterns. What appears on the surface is rarely the full emotional truth. What you often see is protection, not personality. A kind of inner defense that was shaped long before you ever entered their life. Their silence is not always a sign of disinterest. Their distance is not always rejection. And their hesitation to initiate does not automatically mean a lack of care. From a psychological point of view, people with avoidant tendencies are not necessarily afraid of love itself. What they struggle with is what love activates inside them. The loss of emotional control, the exposure of vulnerability, and the feeling of being psychologically seen in a way that feels too intense or too fast. Closeness, for them, can feel like emotional exposure rather than comfort. It can bring up an internal sense of pressure, expectation, and responsibility that becomes difficult to hold. So what they often try to avoid is not a specific person, but the internal emotional state that deep intimacy triggers within them. If you have ever noticed someone pulling away exactly when things start feeling closer, becoming colder when they feel emotionally held, or creating distance when expectations begin to rise, then you are witnessing this internal protective mechanism in action. This is where deeper understanding matters, because surface-level interpretations usually miss the real psychology underneath. This is not about giving easy explanations or comforting narratives. This is about looking directly into the emotional structure behind avoidant behavior, what is actually being protected, what is actually being feared, and what conditions allow them to soften instead of retreat. Many people misunderstand these patterns completely. They conclude that the person is cold, uninterested, incapable of love, or simply not built for connection. But psychologically, that interpretation is incomplete. In most cases, the emotional capacity is not absent, it is guarded. Avoidant patterns are often formed early in life, where emotional needs were either inconsistently met, misunderstood, or felt overwhelming to express. Over time, the nervous system adapts. It learns that closeness can come with pressure, emotional overload, or even a loss of personal space. So later in life, when intimacy begins to deepen, the body reacts before logic does. What looks like withdrawal is often a form of self-protection. When the emotional intensity increases, their system does not interpret it as safety. It interprets it as something that could become consuming. So instead of moving closer, they step back to regain internal balance. At the same time, this is not a simple lack of feeling. Many avoidant individuals do care deeply. There is often a quiet internal conflict between wanting connection and fearing what that connection will demand emotionally. One part of them reaches toward closeness, while another part immediately tries to regulate distance to avoid overwhelm. For them, intimacy does not only activate affection, it also activates a deep sensitivity to emotional expectations. The feeling of being needed too much, responded to too quickly, or emotionally relied upon can create internal tension. It may even feel like they are slowly losing their sense of autonomy inside the relationship. Some individuals are not afraid of loving someone else. They are afraid of what happens to their own emotional stability when they start relying on that love. They fear becoming too emotionally exposed, too available, or too affected by another person's inner world. It is not just fear of the partner, it is fear of their own emotional surrender. That is why deeper connection can paradoxically create discomfort instead of security. What feels like bonding to one person may feel like internal pressure to the avoidant system. When that pressure rises, withdrawal becomes a way to restore a sense of control and self-stability. This is where one of the biggest misunderstandings happens in relationships. When an avoidant person pulls away, it is often interpreted as emotional rejection or loss of interest. But in many cases, it is not about ending the bond. It is about regulating emotional overload. They may still feel attached, they may still care, they may still think about the relationship, but their internal capacity to stay fully engaged becomes temporarily limited. Stepping back gives them space to reset, to calm their nervous system, and to return to themselves without emotional pressure. Distance, in this context, is not always a statement of ending. It is often a coping mechanism, a way of creating internal breathing room when closeness starts to feel too intense to process. And once that internal pressure decreases, they can often reconnect with more clarity and stability. So their silence is not always absence of love, their withdrawal is not always lack of interest, and their need for space is not always a decision to leave. Sometimes it is simply the only way they know how to stay emotionally regulated while still holding the connection in their own way. If you want to understand these patterns on a deeper level and stop misreading emotional distance as simple rejection, you can continue exploring this with avoidant mindset. When this deeper understanding becomes clear, you stop interpreting every moment of distance as a final ending. You start to recognize that, for an avoidant person, space is not always rejection. In many cases, it is simply a pause, something their nervous system needs in order to settle, reset, and breathe again. To truly understand avoidant patterns, it is not enough to look at what they do in the present moment. We also have to consider the emotional history that shaped those reactions in the first place. Many individuals with avoidant tendencies did not grow up in environments where emotions felt safe, consistent, or welcomed. When they were sad, they may have been dismissed or seen as too sensitive. When they needed closeness, they may have experienced cold responses, criticism, or emotional inconsistency. In some cases, love was only offered when they behaved correctly, stayed quiet, or did not express too many needs. Over time, this teaches a silent but powerful lesson. Emotional expression does not always lead to connection. Sometimes it leads to rejection, shame, or disappointment. Because of that, the nervous system begins to adapt. It starts associating need with danger and vulnerability with risk. A deep internal belief forms. The more I rely on someone, the more I can be hurt. The more I open up, the less safe I may become. From that point forward, distance becomes more than a preference. It becomes a survival strategy. They learn to manage things alone, suppress emotional needs, and avoid allowing others too deeply into their internal world. From the outside, this can easily be misread as emotional coldness or lack of interest. But underneath it is often someone who learned early on that closeness does not always feel safe. So they don't live through distance because it feels better. They rely on it because at some point in their life, distance was the only place where emotional harm felt avoidable. One of the most common mistakes in relationships with avoidant individuals is that the other person tries to reduce their own anxiety by increasing emotional pressure. When uncertainty rises, they text more, ask more questions, seek more clarity, and push harder for reassurance. The silence from the avoidant side then triggers even more urgency, creating a cycle that intensifies on both ends. But what is often missed is that, for an avoidant nervous system, this emotional intensity is not experienced as connection. It is experienced as pressure. And when pressure rises too quickly, the internal response is not to move closer, but to retreat further. Questions like, "What are we? Do you still want this?" or "Why are you distant?" may come from a genuine need for security. But for the avoidant person, they can feel like emotional demands arriving before they have had time to process what they are feeling themselves. In that moment, their protective system activates automatically. They withdraw, not because they do not care, but because they are trying to protect their internal stability from feeling overwhelmed. This is the painful cycle that traps many relationships. One person reaches for certainty while the other experiences that reach as pressure and pulls away even more. The more one pursues clarity, the more the other loses emotional space. What actually encourages an avoidant person to engage is not pressure, urgency, or repeated attempts to pull them closer. It is the gradual development of emotional safety. And for them, safety is not created through intensity. It is created through consistency. They begin to open up when they realize they are not being forced to respond immediately, not being controlled by emotional expectation, and not required to sacrifice their inner independence in order to stay connected. What they are really looking for, without always being able to explain it, is a relationship where they can exist without constant emotional demand. That is why the foundation of connection with an avoidant person is steadiness, not dramatic reassurance, not emotional escalation, but a calm and consistent presence. A dynamic where space is not punished, silence is not immediately assumed to be abandonment, and emotional pacing is respected instead of forced. When they begin to experience that their need for space will not be interpreted as betrayal, and their slower emotional rhythm will not be met with panic or pressure, something important begins to shift internally. Their nervous system slowly starts to relax its defensive posture, and in that more regulated state, something new becomes possible. Initiative begins to appear naturally, without force. Avoidant individuals do not respond well to pressure. They respond to emotional safety. And when that safety is experienced consistently over time, the relationship stops feeling like a threat to their independence and starts feeling like a space where they can remain themselves without losing control. This is where emotional neutrality becomes important, even though it is often misunderstood. Many people confuse emotional neutrality with detachment or emotional emptiness, but that is not its meaning. Emotional neutrality is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel deeply without turning those feelings into pressure directed at another person. You still experience fear, sadness, and insecurity, but you do not allow those emotions to immediately dictate your actions in a way that escalates tension. You do not transform anxiety into repeated messages. You do not convert fear into demands for instant reassurance. You do not make your emotional distress something the other person must resolve immediately in order for you to feel okay. This kind of grounded emotional presence is especially powerful in relationships with avoidant individuals because it removes the sense that they are responsible for managing someone else's emotional intensity while still trying to regulate their own. For example, instead of reacting with panic and saying, "Why are you ignoring me? What's wrong? Do you still want this relationship?" A more grounded response might sound like, "I can sense you might need some space right now." When you begin to truly understand what is happening beneath avoidant behavior, something fundamental shifts in the way you interpret relationships. You stop reacting to surface-level actions as if they are final statements about love or loss, and you start seeing them as part of a deeper emotional regulation process that is often invisible from the outside. In many relationships, distance is immediately interpreted as rejection. Silence is taken as absence of care. Slower responses are seen as loss of interest, but when you understand avoidant psychology more deeply, you realize that these assumptions are often incomplete. What looks like emotional withdrawal on the surface can actually be an internal attempt to regain balance, reduce overwhelm, and restore a sense of safety within themselves. This is why your internal response matters more than your external wording. When you reach a point where you can say something like, "I'm here, and when you're ready, we can continue," without emotional panic behind it, the entire psychological energy of the interaction changes. In that moment, you are no longer operating from fear. You are not chasing reassurance. You are not collapsing emotionally into uncertainty, and you are not abandoning the connection either. Instead, you are holding a stable middle position. You remain present but not intrusive. You remain available but not demanding. You remain connected but not overwhelming. That emotional stability communicates something powerful without needing to force anything. It sends a signal that connection is not dependent on pressure, urgency, or emotional intensity. It exists in a calmer form, one that does not punish space and does not interpret silence as abandonment. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this kind of emotional environment is often unfamiliar at first. Their internal system is usually shaped by earlier experiences where closeness may have felt inconsistent, overwhelming, or emotionally demanding. Because of that, their nervous system often associates intimacy not only with warmth, but also with pressure. So when they encounter consistency without emotional escalation, something important begins to shift slowly over time. The body starts to learn that closeness does not always lead to loss of control. That emotional connection does not automatically require self-sacrifice. That being seen does not always result in emotional overwhelm. And when this begins to register internally, the changes in behavior are usually subtle rather than dramatic. They may begin to initiate contact more naturally, not because they feel forced to respond, but because curiosity returns when pressure decreases. Their communication may become more relaxed, less guarded, less mechanical. Instead of simply replying to maintain distance, they might start engaging in a more genuine way, asking questions about your life or sharing small details that were previously kept private. These are not random behaviors. They are small indicators of reduced internal defense. They show that the emotional system is no longer in a constant state of protection and is beginning to allow more openness without immediate threat detection. One of the clearest signs of change is how they return after distance. Earlier patterns of withdrawal may have felt abrupt or emotionally closed off, but over time, if safety is being built, the return often feels different. There is more softness in it, less emotional shutdown, more awareness of the connection that exists, even if it was temporarily paused. To an outside observer, these shifts might look insignificant, but internally, they represent something much deeper. They indicate that the nervous system is slowly beginning to unlink closeness from danger. That emotional proximity is starting to feel less like a threat to independence and more like something that can exist without loss of self. What may seem like a simple message or small gesture is, for them, often a significant internal step. It is a moment where old protective patterns are slightly loosened, where emotional defenses are not fully active, where connection is being tested in a safer, more regulated state. However, this entire understanding only becomes healthy when it is balanced with boundaries. This is where many people unintentionally lose themselves. Once they learn about avoidant patterns, they can become overly accommodating. They start tolerating emotional inconsistency, prolonged silence, or lack of clarity in the hope that patience alone will eventually create change. They begin to believe that understanding someone means accepting everything without limits. But emotional awareness is not the same as self-neglect, and compassion is not the same as self-erasure. You can understand that someone withdraws because they feel overwhelmed without accepting a dynamic where your emotional needs are continuously left unmet. You can recognize that space is necessary for them without abandoning your own need for consistency, clarity, and respect in return. Real emotional maturity exists in holding both truths at the same time. You understand their internal world, but you do not abandon your own. You stay calm, but not silent in your own emotional experience. You remain patient, but not passive in your boundaries. You are not controlling the situation, but you are also not sacrificing your self-worth to keep it alive. This is what creates real stability in a relationship. Not emotional extremes, not pursuit and withdrawal cycles, but a grounded middle space where both people are responsible for their part of the connection. Behind avoidant behavior, there is usually a deeper emotional history that is not immediately visible in present-day actions. What looks like distance, silence, or emotional withdrawal is often not a simple preference or lack of interest, but a learned way of protecting the self. At some point in their development, emotional closeness may have felt unsafe, unpredictable, or overwhelming. Because of that, vulnerability stopped feeling like something that naturally leads to connection, and instead started feeling like something that could lead to discomfort, rejection, or emotional instability. Over time, the nervous system adapts to this experience. When emotional intensity rises, the internal system does not always interpret it as warmth or bonding. Instead, it can register it as pressure or threat. So distance becomes a form of regulation. It is not necessarily chosen in a fully conscious way, but learned as a way to restore internal calm. In this sense, avoidant behavior is less about rejecting connection and more about managing emotional overload. Understanding this creates space for empathy. It allows you to see that what appears as coldness on the surface may actually be protection underneath. However, this understanding becomes unhealthy when it turns into self-neglect. Empathy is valuable, but it should never come at the cost of abandoning your own emotional needs or tolerating dynamics that consistently hurt you. Your role in such a dynamic is not to fix, rescue, or heal the other person through your patience alone. It is not your responsibility to undo someone else's emotional conditioning or to erase your own needs in order to make the relationship function. Trying to do that often leads to imbalance, where one person carries most of the emotional weight while the other remains in a protective withdrawal state. Instead, your role is to stay emotionally grounded. This means you respond from a place of clarity rather than fear. You do not react impulsively from anxiety, and you do not try to force closeness when the other person pulls away. At the same time, you do not silence your own emotional reality. You are aware of what you feel, what you need, and what you are willing or unwilling to accept. This balance is important because it allows you to see the relationship more clearly. You begin to notice whether emotional responsibility is shared or whether it is consistently one-sided. A healthy connection is not defined by constant intensity, but by mutual effort, mutual respect, and emotional stability from both sides over time. Love, in its healthiest form, is not meant to feel like a cycle of anxiety and pursuit. It is not meant to keep you in a constant state of guessing, overthinking, or emotional uncertainty. If a relationship repeatedly creates confusion and forces you into self-abandonment in order to maintain it, then something in that dynamic is not balanced. At its best, love allows both closeness and space without fear. It gives room for individuality without emotional disconnection. It does not require you to disappear emotionally in order to keep someone present in your life. Nor does it require you to suppress your truth just to avoid conflict or abandonment. So, the deeper lesson here is not only about understanding avoidant behavior, but about understanding emotional balance in general. It is about recognizing when to stay engaged, when to give space, and when to protect your own sense of self within a relationship. Because the true goal in any emotional connection is not to control the other person's readiness or force them into openness. And it is not to lose yourself while waiting for them to change. The real goal is to remain emotionally aware, grounded in your boundaries, and connected to your own self-respect, while still allowing love to exist in a way that does not cost you your inner stability. In the end, love should never require you to choose between understanding someone else's wounds and honoring your own. The healthiest connection is the one where awareness does not turn into self-sacrifice, where patience does not become self-abandonment, and where care for another person never means losing care for yourself. Because real love is not proven by how much you can endure. It is revealed in how fully you can stay true to yourself while still choosing connection with clarity, balance, and respect.